Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Welcome back to Wisdom Torah and this week's Torah portion, where we're going to be talking about Vayigash, which is Genesis 44, verse 18 through 47, verse 27. Now, I'm pretty excited about this week's Torah portion because we are going to be talking about the honor that has been acquired by Joseph and comparing that to the honor that has been acquired by Yeshua. Because keep in mind that there is two understandings to the role of Messiah within Judaism, and also how we begin to see the shadow pictures of Messiah throughout the Torah and the Tanakh. But it is tied to the various roles and the deeds that he's acquired and the honor in which he has been bestowed through the things that he's done. So we're going to take chapters 45 of this week and go through the text and then compare that to the vizier position of ancient Egypt to show just how important that position within the hierarchy of the kingdom of Egypt really was, and to show how that connects to Yeshua being the Messiah. And this is extremely important because if we don't understand how these roles were portrayed or how they were understood in their actual time frames, then we're going to have a little bit of a difficulty seeing the importance of the position that Joseph was put into. Okay, so I'm really excited about what we're going to talk about today. Obviously, we can't go through the entire portion this week because there's just too much text to read, and we have a lot of information to cover just in the vizier and comparing that to the honor of Joseph and Yeshua. But I want to make sure that we real briefly make mention of the outline of this Torah portion so you could see some of the other honor elements that are within just these chapters, which is really interesting because the very first verse that we read about in Genesis 44:18, which is the opening of this portion, where it says, "Then Judah went up to him and said, 'Please, my master, let your servant speak a word to my master, and do not be angry with your servant, though you are equal to Pharaoh himself.'" Now, just that very opening verse is talking about the honor that Joseph has in the eyes of Egypt and all of the nations that are vassal kingdoms to Egypt. Okay, so the very opening verse of this portion is linked to the honor of that position. Okay, we're going to read through 45 here in a minute, but one other thing I want to make mention of chapters 46 is where we begin to go through the lineage. Remember, this is talking about the ascribed honor through lineage and how this all connects to the honor of Israel. And what I find it interesting is that not only is it linking Israel's sons, and they're showing how the honor goes on to their sons through Israel, through Jacob, but it also mentions Israel, Jacob's wives, and showing how the lineage through those wives and Rachel, Rebecca, Zilpah, and what's her other one's name? Zilpah, Rachel, and Bilhah. So you have all four of Jacob's wives, is showing how it says that these are the sons of each one of those wives, and also showing you that it is ascribed honor through each one of those wives. So it's extremely important that you go back and you recognize how important these genealogies are. We've talked about this in the past and showing on how important the genealogies are, because in the past we've always just pretty much just read over those genealogies without really recognizing that they are directly linked to understanding honor and shame within the ancient Near Eastern culture. Okay, now 47 goes on to talk more about the deeds that Joseph does to acquire more honor for himself by what he does for his father and what he does for those people that are experiencing the famine. So it's this whole entire portion is basically centered around the acquired honor of Joseph. And that carries on into a shadow picture of the greater honor of which Yeshua has acquired. Okay, now one of the questions I want to propose to you is that, did you know that the Grand Vizier, which is the position in which Joseph had in the hierarchy of the kingdom of Egypt, was the second in command position? And that position was directly responsible for maintaining justice and righteousness within the kingdom of Egypt. Okay, and that goes on not unto just the borders of Egypt, but also into Canaan, because keep in mind at this time that Egypt was the suzerain of the land of Canaan. The Hittites and part of the Hittite kingdom, and the land of Canaan south of the Hittite kingdom was all under Egyptian control. So it is up to the vizier to make sure that the justice and righteousness of the kingdom is placed upon his control or on his shoulders, and is to be maintained by that person. Okay, which is extremely interesting because we know that this is directly linked to Messiah's role also. He is directly linked and responsible for maintaining the justice and righteousness of Yah, of the suzerain king within the land of Israel and of all the world. Because remember, Israel is going to be a suzerain nation at the time of Mashiach's rule and reign here on the earth. Okay, so there's all sorts of connections to Joseph's life that we see all throughout the ending of Genesis here, and showing how they are directly linked to the honor acquired by Yeshua. And it's really mind-blowing when you start to think about it. You look at just how important this position of the Grand Vizier is in Egypt. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to read through chapters 45, and then we're going to make some connections with some of the resources so we can begin to see that Joseph's life is extremely important to understanding the role of Messiah ben Yosef. He's coming to be a Messiah as Joseph was. Okay, keep in mind that the two roles and the two understandings within Judaism of Mashiach ben Yosef and Mashiach ben David are directly linked to honor in the means of ascribed and acquired honor. Okay, this is extremely important, and if we don't recognize how Joseph's life through his lineage and how Joseph's life through his deeds show that he is a Mashiach or Messiah-like figure, then we're going to have difficulty seeing it with Yeshua. But there doesn't need to be any difficulty anymore if we understand the honor and shame culture. Okay, so let's take a look at chapters 45, and I am going to be reading out of the Archaeological Study Bible. This is an NIV version. Now, we've said this in the past, that we don't necessarily agree with all of the translations. Okay, but I do like the way that some of the wording is in this particular chapter pertaining to honor and shame in chapters 45. Okay, so we're going to use this version. You can still use your other version, but the point is that some of the Hebrew words that we're going to be talking about are traced back to honor. Okay, so chapters 45, this is where Joseph is making himself known to his brothers. Now, it says in verse 1, "Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, 'Have everyone leave my presence.' So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. And Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, 'I am Joseph. Is my father still living?' But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence." Now, I want you to keep in mind, as we're reading these verses, try to make the connections of this being about Joseph and maintaining the honor of his father. This is the same thing that happens with Yeshua, and we're going to read a lot of verses in the Gospel of John. I'm going to be doing a in-depth series on the Gospel of John, so a lot of this stuff is kind of fresh in my brain as I'm studying it, so I want to be able to share some of those verses with you as we're going through this chapter, to show the importance of what Joseph is doing by trying to maintain and lift up the honor of his father. Even though that Joseph is probably the most powerful man in the land at this point besides Pharaoh, okay, he's still maintaining and trying to bring honor to his father, recognizing that his father has a higher authority over him. Okay. Verse 4, "Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Come close to me.' When he had done so, he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that Elohim, that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve you for a remnant on earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but Elohim. He made me father to Pharaoh, master of his entire household, and ruler over Egypt.'" Now keep that in mind, because we're going to be reading some verses here in a little bit in the Gospel of John, talking about how Yeshua was sent by Yah, by Elohim, and he has all of the authority of the Father in the land of Israel and over all the earth. Okay, so we begin to make some of these connections of the same honor that has been bestowed upon Joseph is the same honor that has been bestowed on Yeshua. Okay, now we'll stop right here real quickly to make mention of the father to Pharaoh. That doesn't necessarily mean that he is actually Pharaoh's father. Keep in mind that ancient covenantal terms were father and son, or are basically suzerain vassal, or it is basically just saying that Pharaoh has made him the father over all of Egypt, because bottom line is that Pharaoh couldn't do everything. He delegated most of the authority within the kingdom to the Grand Vizier, okay, or the Viceroy, or whatever you want to call it. Joseph is second in command. He is the man. He's the guy. Okay. So verse 9. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, this is what your son Joseph says. Elohim has made me master of all Egypt. Come down to me and don't delay. You shall live in the reign of Goshen and be near me, you, your children, your grandchildren, your flocks and your herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all who belong to you will become destitute. So here we begin to see that Joseph is telling Judah and the rest of his brothers to go and gather his father and bring back all of the family, all of their belongings, because there's a famine coming. He's telling him that he's going to take care of him and maintain the justice and righteousness that is so important to the foundation of the kingdom of Egypt. Now keep in mind, as we've talked about this before, that one of the many goddesses or gods of Egypt was Ma'at. Okay, Ma'at was the goddess of justice and righteousness. Now in ancient Egypt, maintaining justice and righteousness and doing acts of taking care of those who are less fortunate, the widow, the orphan, the poor, and doing those things were at the very core of the life of every single Egyptian. It just wasn't the foundation of the governmental institution of Egypt. Okay, now this is one of the reasons why when new nations have been formed in past generations, that they've referred to the ancient Egyptian law codes, or the text that we do have pertaining to how the Egyptians set up their kingdoms, because they were known as having the best laws within the lands, because they maintained of doing acts of justice and righteousness. Okay. And this is so important to the Egyptians, because this determined on what would happen to them in the afterlife. And we've talked about this in some of last year's Torah portions, the royal messenger topic, and so on and so forth. So we have to keep in mind that maintaining justice and righteousness is extremely important to all the Egyptians, every single person within the Egyptian kingdom. It's the same thing as it's supposed to be that important to us as Hebrews, or walking in the Israelite covenant. Okay, maintaining acts of justice and righteousness should be at the very core of everything that we do. It isn't just about keeping commandments. Okay, this is extremely important to understand, because this is what Joseph is doing. Joseph knows that position that he is placed in as the vizier, which I'm going to show you in a second, and some of the other resources we have, is that the Grand Vizier, it is on his shoulders to make sure that the kingdom as a whole, the governments of ancient Egypt, maintains that justice and righteousness, and that he does everything humanly possible to make sure that the people of the kingdom are taken care of. So this is what he's doing, even with his brothers and his father's household, because remember, is that they're dwelling in the land of Canaan. This still falls under Egyptian control. This falls under Joseph's authority. So he has to do this. This is something that I'd never seen before, actually, now that we're talking about it, because they were living and dwelling in the land of Canaan, which was still under the authority of the Egyptian kingdom at that time. Okay, so keep that in mind, of how important understanding Ma'at is. See, it doesn't matter because they're a pagan nation. Okay, some of the things that they did within the hierarchy and within their laws were still good things. Okay, we know that they corrupted everything with a goddess and a god, and everything turned into a pagan deal or whatever. It doesn't matter at this point. It's about understanding on how important that doing deeds and acts of justice and righteousness are linked to the honor in which that person's reputation was. Okay, this is the same thing with Joseph, and we see this all throughout the story of Joseph. Okay, Now, this is where it gets interesting. In verse 12, it says, "You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Now here, this is the key verse of this chapter. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me in Egypt, about everything you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly." Now, the reason why I chose to read the NIV version out of this is because of the way they worded it. Tell my father about all the honor accorded me. Remember, we're talking about either ascribed or acquired honor. We know that Joseph's honor is ascribed to him through his lineage through Jacob and through Abraham and so on and so forth. Okay, but he has been accorded honor in the eyes of Pharaoh, in the eyes of Egypt. How? Well, because of all the things that he did as far as interpreting the dreams and so on and so forth. And no one was able to do this for Pharaoh. And interpretation of dreams is extremely important in the kingdom of Egypt. If you have time, research that. Look into how important that really was. That played a significant role in Joseph's rising so quickly to this position of Grand Vizier. So he's acquired these things, and now that he's also acquired honor by the 7 years of plenty that has happened. Okay, but the reason why, back to verse 13, because of the way it's worded, the honor accorded to me. If you go back and let's compare this really quickly to some of the other versions, 45:13, and we'll compare just so you can see that they've translated this a little bit differently in a lot of these versions. Okay, the Geneva, "Therefore tell my father all my honor in Egypt and all that you have seen, and make haste and bring my father hither." King James 16:11, "And you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt, and of all that you have seen, and you shall haste and bring down my father hither." Let's see, King James Version, "And you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt." King James, okay, we got the King James. Let's see, the Scriptures version, the one that we also love to use. I'm not knocking any one version. It's just in light of all of these things that Abba is allowing us to discover and to see in our present time frame. It just makes some of the versions make it extremely difficult to read things in their actual context. So the Scripture version says, "And you shall inform my father of all my esteem in Egypt and of all that you have seen, and you shall hurry and bring my father down here." Let's see, what else do we have? American Standard, "And you shall tell my father of all my glory in Egypt and all that you have seen." So we could begin to see that most of them translated as the glory that they have seen. And if we go back and you look at the Strong's, and the root word that is used for glory is the kavod. Okay, and we know that by going through the honor and shame book that we've been reading, that word is directly linked to the honor and shame culture. Okay, and it could actually mean honor or dignity, honor, reverence, or glory. Let's see, what else do we have here? Abundance, honor, splendor, glory, honor, dignity, glory. So it's directly linked to the term honor. Okay, so now when we begin to see the word glory in the New Testament or the first century writings, you can link that is also directly connected to the honor and shame culture. So this wording in this verse is extremely important because he needs to go down, his brothers need to go and tell their father of all of the honor that has been bestowed, to show his father he is indeed alive, and he is going to be the one who brings him into the land of Egypt, and he takes care of them. Okay, verse 14. "Then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him, weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. Afterward, his brothers talked with him. When news reached Pharaoh's place that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all of his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, 'Tell your brothers to do this.'" So now we see that Pharaoh knows that Joseph's brothers are there. He's going to send them away with multiple gifts. He's going to send them away with wagons full of things so that Israel or Jacob is able to recognize that his brothers just aren't making this stuff up, but they're seeing the deeds that Pharaoh is also doing unto Joseph's family. So you can see just how important this position is. This wasn't just any old Egyptian or any position within the kingdom. Okay, Joseph was second in command. He is the one who had all the authority. Remember, he had the signet ring. He had all the authority of Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Tell your brothers, do this. Load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land." You are also directed to tell them, "Do this. Take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours." So he's basically saying, just leave all your stuff behind. We're going to give you the best of the kingdom. So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts as Pharaoh had commanded, and he also gave them provisions for their journey. To teach them, he gave new clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes, which that verse alone is very interesting. And I started thinking about this last week as we were going through this, because it always comes up, it seems, in discussions about last week's Torah portion and this week's, about the firstborn of Israel, and how come there's always this importance on Joseph and Benjamin. And what I come to realize, and where I'm at right now, is that, keep in mind, is that all of the brothers sold Joseph into slavery. They kidnapped him and sold him into slavery. So that is actually punishable by death in the Torah. And Ryan alluded to this and talked a little bit about it in last week's Torah portion. So to me, that automatically disqualified all of them from actually becoming the heir to Jacob's house. Remember, the double portion. This is why we see that Joseph gets the coat with the inheritance, or the pocket put into his coat, because, well, that was before that too. So, but because Joseph left, I believe that authority directly went to Benjamin. Okay. Anyway, that's probably a discussion for another time. But verse 22, to each of them he gave new clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And this is what he sent to his father: 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 female donkeys loaded with grain and bread and other provisions for his journey. Then he sent his brothers on their way, and as they were leaving he said to them, "Don't quarrel on the way." So they went out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. They told him, "Joseph is still alive. In fact, he is ruler over all Egypt." Jacob was stunned. He did not believe them. But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. And Israel said, "I am convinced my son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Now, with that being all said, and we read the chapter, I want to be able to give you some resources on just how important the vizier's position is. As we still got some time left, and then I want to be able to go into the first century writings and show you the acquired honor, the greater honor of Mashiach, because he does greater deeds than Joseph has done. This doesn't mean that anything that Joseph has done is diminished, but it's to show you a shadow picture of what Joseph was doing as a Messiah role-like figure during his time frame of maintaining justice and righteousness for all of the people under his control or under his authority, and to show the same things that Yeshua has done. And we're going to read those greater deeds that he's done. Now, I want to share with you guys from the ancient Near Eastern text. We've used this many, many times over the last 2-3 years now. And I want to read a little bit about the Vizier of Egypt and some of the notes that are within this. And then we have an article that is, I want to briefly read some information out of it also pertaining to this position, because this is extremely important. If we don't understand the position and the roles in which the Grand Vizier was supposed to maintain in the hierarchy of the Kingdom of Egypt, then we're not going to understand these important facets to understanding Messiah's various roles. Okay. Now, the Vizier of Egypt, it says on page, why do I not have a page number? 212 and 213 of the ancient Near Eastern texts. By dogma, the Pharaoh of Egypt was the state. But in actual practice, he had to delegate authority to others. We've already said that. Pharaoh cannot do everything, so he delegates a lot of his authority to the people under him. But the Grand Vizier was the second guy. He got most of the authority delegated to him. The most important civil office official was the Vizier, who was directly responsible to the Pharaoh and to whom most of other officials were responsible. So not only was the Grand Vizier second in command, that all the other viziers underneath the second in command, the Grand Vizier, which was Joseph, all those other viziers under him had to fall under the authority of Joseph. We possess a fair amount of material with regard to the Vizier under the Egyptian Empire. The following texts relate to Rachmi-Ra, the Vizier of Upper Egypt under the reign of Thutmose III. The texts are from the tomb of Rachmi-Ra, number 100 at Thebes. And it just gives you the actual text number, that kind of stuff. But I want to read some of this so you can see this is actual from texts and clay tablets that they have found pertaining to this position. Okay, and it says that I was a noble, the second of the king, and the fourth of him who judged the pair. And then it gives you a little note next to this word, the pair. And it says here at this note that he was the immediate assistant of the king, just as if he were a partner of the god Thoth in judging Horus and Seth, thus making a fourth to these three gods. So this position of Grand Vizier was actually seen as a god. Remember that they believed that Pharaoh was the son of God. Okay, the sun god, or the son of the sun god. So in turn, it makes sense that the second in command would also be viewed as someone also as a deity or a deified position. Okay, as I'm saying this, all of these things are just coming through my brain pertaining to Yeshua. Okay, I personally believe that Yeshua is divine. For me, hands down, there's no question about it. Once we understand the royal messenger position, once we understand this position of the Grand Vizier, and once we understand all of this stuff pertaining to honor and shame, the authority of the house, there's no discrepancies for me anymore. So even as I'm reading this, and I haven't even thought about some of these things, it's saying that he was actually thought of as being deified or being a divine, having a divine position. And now what we're going to read in John chapters 5 and John chapters 10 here in a little bit makes perfect sense. Mind-blowing. Anyway, continue on in the text where it says, it was the first occasion of my being summoned. All my brothers were in our outer office. We're in the outer office. So now I'm wondering, because this is mentioning his brothers, and his brothers, keep in mind, would have been viziers or covenantal people in a sense, because remember, these are all terms of being in covenant with one another. And I wonder if the brothers that he's referring to would have been other vizier positions within his office. So if that's the case, it could be possible that also that Joseph's brothers and his father all come into a elevated position within the hierarchy of the kingdom. Wow. Something to consider. Something to look into. All my brothers were in the outer office. I went forth, clad of fine linen. I reached the doorway of the palace gates. The courtiers bent their backs, and I found the masters of ceremonies clearing the way before me. My abilities were not as they had been. My yesterday's nature had altered itself since I had come forth to the accoutrements of the vizier, having been promoted to be prophet of Ma'at. Okay, now remember, we've already talked about Ma'at. So here he gets promoted, this guy gets promoted into a position of Grand Vizier, and he says that he becomes a prophet of Ma'at. What is Ma'at? Ma'at is justice and righteousness. That person was responsible for carrying that out within the structure of the hierarchy of the kingdom throughout all of Egypt and the lands that Egypt was over at the time of that position. Okay. Now it says here that the goddess Ma'at was truth or justice. Okay, it was maintaining. And remember that the goddess Ma'at was represented by a picture of a woman who was holding two scales. Okay, and we talked a lot about this in last year's Torah portions, where we see that Pharaoh's heart was hardened all the time. And we talked about the many times. It was like 20 some times that Pharaoh's heart being hardened is mentioned in the book of Exodus, coming up very soon. And the reason for that is because that's how they believed that they were judged in the afterlife. The very first position that they came to was the scales of Ma'at, where their heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. The feather represented the acts of justice and righteousness. If their heart outweighed the heart, that means that they did not do everything that they were supposed to as far as justice and righteousness in their life, and they didn't get to go into the greater things of the afterlife. Okay, so it mentions that Ma'at is truth or justice. In his capacity as the highest magistrate, Rachmi Ra was the priest of Ma'at, which that also there is interesting, because we know, well, that's probably, we'll save that comment for another time. The same word Ma'at as that of above, but here determined with a picture of a goddess. Okay, let's keep reading in the text. I was summoned again into the presence of the good God, Thutmose III. His majesty opened his mouth and spoke his words veritably in my presence. Now behold, I see a face which I send to my heart. That decisions are many without limit to them, and the judging of cases never falls off. Would thou mightest act in conformance with what I may say, then Ma'at will rest in her place. He charged me. That verse right there, or that comment, that Ma'at will rest in her place, is directly linked to the goddess that we were just speaking of. Okay, I want to be able to move on from that, where it says the next section is talking about the installation of the vizier, and that's what we're going to be reading out of this article here in a second, where it says another long text gives the charge which Thutmose III laid upon his newly appointed vizier. There's a comment here. Okay, here we go. The regulations for sitting of the mayor and the vizier of the southern city of the residents in the hall of the vizier. Now, one thing that I want to make mention, this is extremely important, especially when we start seeing this type of terminology in the New Testament or the first century writings, is that the grand vizier, because he had this great authority position, is he had a judgment seat. Okay, when Pharaoh was not able to make certain judgments, he passed that authority on to the grand vizier, especially the things that fell under the jurisdiction of the position. But the grand vizier's judgment seat sat in what was called the Hall of Justice. Okay, this is extremely important, because we know that Joseph sat in the same seat, so he had to rule and make his decisions of Ma'at, or justice and righteousness, from this seat. Okay, so he's doing it from a hall of justice. And we also see that Messiah makes the same type of judgment for sitting from the right hand of the Father. This is also known as the judgment seat. Paul talks about this all over the place in his writings. Okay, so it says, as for everything which this official, the vizier, shall do while holding hearings in the hall of the vizier, he shall sit upon the judgment chair, the judgment seat, with a matting on the floor, the matting over him, a cushion under his back, and a cushion under his feet. Upon him a scepter in his hand, and 40 leather straps spread out in front of him. The chiefs of southern tens on whom sides are in front of him. Overseer, the cabinet on the right hand, the supervisor of clients on his left hand. Very interesting. And the scribe of the vizier beside him, one confronting another, and every man opposite him. Let one be heard after his fellow, not permitting the last to be heard before and earlier. If one who is earlier should say, there is no one hearing near me, then he is to be taken in charge by the messengers of the vizier. Okay, so that just goes on to show you that he sat actually in this judgment seat to make all of the righteous judgments pertaining to the authority of justice and righteousness in the land. And when he commits these acts of justice and righteousness, the key to this, guys, is understanding that those acts are ascribes even more honor by the deeds in which Joseph has done. Okay, it's the same thing that happens with Yeshua. These acts of justice and righteousness that he does, and judging accordingly to how Yah wants him to judge from the kingdom seat, from the throne, he acquires more honor for himself in the eyes of the people. Okay, now before we jump into chapters 10, hold on a second. Let's go to Matthew 11 real quick before we jump into this other stuff in this article. So Matthew 11 verses 2 through 6 talks about these greater deeds, this greater honor that Yeshua has acquired for himself. When John begins to question if Yeshua really is the Messiah, because he's in prison, remember? So let's go to John. I got John on the brain. Matthew chapter 11. Verses, what did I say? 2 through 6. Okay, so John the Immerser, John the Baptist, is already in prison, and he begins to question now if Yeshua is the Messiah or if he is to look for another. And here's what it says. When John heard in prison what Messiah was doing, he sent his disciples to ask him, "Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?" Yeshua replied, "Go back and report to John what you hear and what you see." It isn't just what he hears. They have to be able to see these acts of justice and righteousness that Yeshua has done. And keep in mind that nobody else has done. No one else has done these. The blind receive sight. The lame walk. Those who have leprosy are cured. The deaf hear. The dead are raised. That is the number one riposte to Hasatan's challenge of Yah's authority that you will see all throughout Scripture. The resurrection. That is the number one riposte of honor. Keep that in mind. Nobody else could do that. Only Yeshua could do it. And the good news is preached to the poor. Blessed is the man who does not fall away on account of me. So we see that just these verses alone begins to talk, and we know that as we go through all the Gospels and we go through the first century writings, we hear and we see of all of that acquired honor that Yeshua has done and what he's going to do, especially during his rule and reign on the throne in the millennial kingdom. Okay, so we see that the honor that Joseph does, the honor that he does for Israel, his brothers, he does for all of the people living in Egypt, that he does for all of the people living in the land of Canaan that falls under his authority, is keeping in line with the honor, not only the honor of the position in which he held, but he knows that that is directly linked to the honor of Yah, his creator. Okay, he knows this. Okay, this is why he is a shadow of Messiah. So now I want to go into this article and read some of this stuff for you really quickly. It's called The Installation of the Vizier by R.O. Faulkner. And I think we used some of this in last year's Torah portions as well, where this is actually, they've taken a text of the same one we read in the ancient Near Eastern text, and they've broken it out, and then he gives commentary on all of the pieces within that text. Now, I just want to read you basically his closing paragraph on what he says, because it speaks volumes to this position of honor, this high position of honor that Joseph had. Okay? And then we're going to go into John chapter 10. We only got about 20 minutes left. Okay, he says, beginning on page 28, on rereading the text of Pharaoh's speech to his newly appointed vizier, one cannot refrain from remarking once again on the high standard of conduct expected from the greatest of all Egyptian officials. Rank is not to be regarded as an opportunity for aggrandizement and enrichment. And while the recipient of this high honor, this is his words, the recipient of this high honor was certainly much gratified by his selection for it. The Pharaoh points out most explicitly that the responsibilities it involves are far from enjoyable. Favor is to be shown to none, neither high nor low, neither friend nor stranger, And in deciding those cases which come within the vizier's purview, he must not step outside the limits laid down by law and precedent. That means he has to make absolutely just calls from the judgment seat in which he has been given. He cannot show favoritism. We see that all throughout the New Testament, guys. There is, however, a hint that where these fail, he may act on his own judgment. Do not do your own will in matters whereof the law is known. At the same time, he is to give as much latitude as possible to petitioners stating a case, and if his decision goes against them, he is to make his reasons clear. A noticeable point is the attention paid to public opinion. This goes back to the honor and shame. They do everything in the eyes of the public. Okay, Ryan talked a little bit about this in last week's Torah portion. They don't do these things in private because they have high position. It is a matter of public opinion. They have to do everything at the seat. The seat is at the gate. Or in the hall of justice. This is extremely important that the public knows what they are doing. Okay, because it's directly linked to the honor of that position, the honor of that seat in which they are sitting. A noticeable point is the attention paid to public opinion, which must have been a real force even in those far-off days. Not only must justice be done, it must appear to be done. Now keep in mind, we talked about this in the past, especially when it comes to honor that we have taken by means of an oath. We cannot just speak things and not back them up by our actions. This is exactly what it's talking about. If I speak something and then my actions do not back it up, I've actually brought shame upon the oath in which I've taken. This is what they're talking about. As has often been remarked before, the standard of conduct inculcated would not disgrace any civilized nation. If practice often fell short of precept, at least the ideal to be aimed at was clearly seen. One remarkable point about this text is the absence of any reference to criminal procedure. Even the duties inscription with penal powers of the vizier seem to be confined to the punishment of local officials who maltreat his messengers. Wow. And it would appear as if judicial functions dealt solely with civil cases. Probably in ancient Egypt there was no equivalent of our central criminal court. Murder, assault, robbery, and riot were doubtless dealt with by the local police and magistrate, and only the very occasional cause would come under the eye of the vizier, who nevertheless could have access to the criminal archives in case of need, possibly records of all criminal cases throughout the land. That just goes on to show the importance of the position. Okay, so now we've established that Joseph has this position that is very, very, very similar step for step in the role of Messiah. This is why understanding the Mashiach ben Yosef understanding of Judaism's mentality is so important, to recognizing that Yeshua plays both of those roles. He plays that suffering servant, that suffering role of Messiah, and then he's also going to come and conquer as Mashiach ben David, where he's going to reunite all of the tribes, which, by the way, there's so much two-house stuff within this Torah portion that we could probably dedicate 2 hours to showing it. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be a divisive topic, but showing all of the elements that there indeed was 2 houses of Israel, even though the focus is to be on one house of Israel, one united house, one achad, which, remember, achad not only means one, but it also means a faithful house. Okay, and that's what we are called to be. It doesn't need to be any kind of goofy attachments to stuff of 2 houses that's come down through the generations, or over the last few decades, for that matter. But it doesn't also negate the fact that it is there. It is there in the text. And we can see elements of it in this week's Torah portion. Now, where I was going with that is that Yeshua will acquire even more honor in the eyes of all the world when he comes back and he gathers all of the tribes together. Okay, and he unites all the tribes and he conquers all of the enemies of Yah and all the enemies of Israel, acquiring even greater honor than Joseph had. Okay, keep that in mind. This is to show you the various shadow pictures. Okay, now let's go to John chapter 5. And we're running out of time really quick. It's amazing how fast an hour goes by at this point. So John chapter 5, beginning in verses 16 through 30. This is to show you the similar language that we see with Yeshua in the Gospel of John is the same type of terminology and attachments to the throne or the judgment seat of the Grand Vizier. Okay, so John chapter 5, beginning in verse 16 says, "So, because Yeshua was doing these things on the Shabbat, the Jews persecuted him. Yeshua said to them, 'My Father is always at his work, to this very day, and I too am working.' For this reason the Jews tried all the harder to kill him. And not only was he breaking the Shabbat, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with Elohim." Okay, we see the same thing in this week's Torah portion, where it says that Joseph is equal to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh is a representation of the Father. You have to look at the shadow pictures, that the various roles in which these positions are playing within the New Testament. Okay, so you have Pharaoh is portrayed as the father, and then you have Joseph is portrayed as the son, who is also equal in authority. Remember that. They're equal in authority. Okay? So Yeshua gave them this answer: "I tell you the truth, the son can do nothing by himself. Joseph can do nothing by means of Pharaoh. He can do only what he sees his father doing, because whatever the father does, the son also does." Now this is to show how much greater the kingdom of Elohim is. Okay? Minus all the Egyptian stuff, minus all the pagan stuff. "For the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. Yes, to your amazement, he will show him even greater things than these. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life," which is a greater acquired honor, because Pharaoh couldn't do that, Joseph couldn't do that, "even so the Son gives life to whom he pleased to give it. Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son." This is the same thing that we just see in this week's Torah portion with Pharaoh. This position has been given to Joseph. Granted, he's had the position, but Joseph is making just and righteousness rulings from the judgment seat, from the hall of justice, because he's been entrusted with that authority to do so. It's the same thing with Yeshua, but he's making even greater honorable and just decisions from his own position. "Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son, that all," here we go, check this out, "that all may honor the Son, just as they honor the Father. He who does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him." Now, to me, just in light of this position of the Vizier and this verse right here, why do we have any doubt of who Yeshua is? It doesn't need to be anything anymore. "I tell you the truth, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be condemned. He was crossed over from death to life." This is where it's talking about how Yeshua, what he had done on the stake for us, has restored our honor back in the Father's eyes. That's what he's talking about. He has crossed over from death to life. "I tell you the truth, a time is coming and has now come when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of Elohim, and those who hear will live. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son have life in himself. And he has given him authority to judge, because he is the Son of Man. He is the Grand Vizier to the kingdom of Elohim. Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out, and who have done good will rise to live, and those who have done evil will rise to be condemned. By myself I can do nothing, I judge only as I hear, and my judgment is just. For I seek not to please myself, but him who has sent me." This is amazing. Remember, the greatest riposte, Hasatan's greatest challenge to Yah's authority is to show that he can't do all these things that he claims to do. Bring death or bring life to those who have died. And the greatest riposte to that is to show that Yah is the only one that can resurrect us. He's the only one that can resurrect his Son. And he's given all of that authority to his Son. Okay, now let's go to John chapter 10. And this is going to take us pretty much to the end of this week. John chapter 10. Okay, and I want to... Which part about this part of chapter 10 we're interested in because we just came out of the Feast of Hanukkah, and this is the chapter in which he's talking about Hanukkah, and there's some connections in here that I want to be able to talk about. Okay, now let's go ahead and begin. Let's begin in verse 14. Well, actually verse 11. So John chapter 10, verse 11 says that I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd who owns the sheep. So when he sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he has a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. This is similar to what is happening in this Torah portion when Joseph is in his high authority position of Egypt, but he has to go and get his brothers, he has to go and get his father, he has to go and get the Israelites to bring them into the fold so they are protected throughout the 7 years of famine. They too will listen to my voice, and they shall be one flock and one shepherd. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down on my own accord. I have authority to lay it down, and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. All these words the Jews were again divided. Many of them said, he is demon-possessed and raving mad. Why listen to him? But others said, these are not the sayings of a man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? So he's talking about all of the acquired acts that he has done. Then came the Feast of Dedication at Jerusalem. It was winter, and Yeshua was in the temple area walking in Solomon's colonnade. The Jews gathered around him saying, how long will you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. Yeshua answered, I did tell you, but you did not believe. The miracles I do in my Father's name speak for me. But you do not believe because you are not my sheep. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish, and no one can snatch them out of my hand. My Father has given them to me, is greater than all. No one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and the Father are one. The same as Joseph and Pharaoh were to be recognized as being one. Okay. Again, the Jews picked up the stones to stone him, but Yeshua said to them, I have shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We are not stoning you for any of these, replied the Jews, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. Yeshua answered them, it is not written in your law, I have said you are gods. If he called them gods, to whom the word of God came, and the scripture cannot be broken, what about the one whom the Father set apart as his very own and sent into the world? Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy because I said I am God's Son? Do not believe me unless I do what my Father does. But if I do it, even though you do not believe me, believe the miracles, that you may know and understand that the Father is me and I in Father. Again they tried to seize him, but he escaped their grasp. Then Yeshua went back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing in the early days there. Now this is talking about all of the things that he has done to acquire the honor as the role of Messiah. The same way in which Joseph had acquired all the things that he has done in order to take care of the people during the famine and during the years of plenty. Okay, so this week I wanted us to be able to see that the vizier position which Joseph had is extremely important, and understanding just how that position was directly linked to the honor of Pharaoh and how Pharaoh and his kingdom were portrayed all throughout the world at that time by maintaining acts of justice, righteousness, and the same thing in which the role of Messiah is concerned. Okay, now if Messiah would come and somebody claims to be Messiah, he does not do these greater acts of honor that are directly linked to raising us from the dead, giving sight to the blind, bringing hearing to the deaf. And so all these things that we read about in Matthew chapter 11, then it doesn't show that he had any greater authority than anybody else that came before him. This is why understanding those various roles of shadow pictures are extremely important to understanding who Yeshua is. And there doesn't need to be any discrepancies anymore. Okay? There's too many people right now, ladies and gentlemen, that we are hearing about that are walking away from their faith, that are walking away from Messiah because they don't agree with the history. They don't agree with any of these cultural concepts that we've all been talking about. That's fine. If that's where somebody's at and you want to reject all of the things that do nothing but bring clarity to the role of Messiah, then what else can we do? Your and I job is to continue and to focus on the roles that we have each as individuals have been given to share the truth. Continue to share the truth in these areas. That's what we are called to do. Okay? So hopefully today, as we are able to see the Grand Vizier, and as we go through next week's Torah portion, that this gives us a better understanding of the honor that Joseph acquired for himself, and that also that Yeshua has acquired for himself. So I thank you for taking time to join me this week, and I will see you again in a few weeks. Rico and Ryan are going to be in Israel, so we are working out the schedule for who's going to be doing which Torah portion coming up. So I look forward to seeing you guys again soon. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you.